Story number 1.
John and Susan's family life, which had recently been filled with passion, had been ruthlessly consumed by the demands of everyday life and the responsibilities of raising 3 children. Frankly speaking, the head of the family felt extremely disappointed and almost deceived, despite the fact that on the surface, everything looked different. It all started on a promising note. John, being 11 years older than his young wife, a rarity in today's world, he was her first man. Under his careful guidance, Susan blossomed as a woman. From that moment on, he stopped finding his former girlfriends charming. He began to look at them under a microscope, noticing flaws he'd never noticed before: cellulite, gray hairs, sloppily groomed bikini zones. For some reason, he was drawn to the innocent girl living in her imaginary world of pink ponies and princes. It wasn't hard for an alpha male like him to charm this naive beauty with her perfect body, because he knew all the tricks to please women. He knew when to be gentle and when to be assertive. With the right approach, he unlocked the door to her heart. However, he could hardly explain to himself what went wrong when he let his guard down. Exploring her young body too vigorously, he had forgotten that excessive pleasure could lead to bigger problems. John was used to his previous girlfriends taking care of themselves to avoid unwanted consequences in bed. Susan, on the other hand, had to be taught everything John knew. Then one day, the inevitable happened. As usual, he came to pick up his girlfriend from the university to bring her to his apartment. There was an air of anticipation inside him. Today, he wanted to show her some interesting techniques in the bedroom. However, he realized from the expression on Susan's face as she approached the car that something was wrong. Her cheeks had taken on a pale green hue, and her eyes were staring into the ground. A feeling of unease rose in John's chest. He was afraid that her mother had found out about their relationship and forbade her daughter from seeing him. According to Susan's stories, her mother was an extremely evil woman. However, the reality was even more horrific. Sitting in the front seat, Susan continued to unnerve John with her silence. He knew how to get her to give in, and barely touching her skin with his fingertips, drew a line from her knee to her sensitive area. Instead of a passionate kiss, however, she finally mustered up the courage to speak. "I think I might be pregnant. The girls bought a test for me at the drugstore, and I took it at recess." 2 stripes. John, as if at the same time, experienced the shock of the cold water and the attachment of the electrodes to his body. For a brief moment, he found it difficult to even breathe. This meant the end of everything. In any case, he was completely unprepared for such a situation. It was one thing to enjoy mutual pleasure, but it was quite another to start a family and raise children. Of course, he imagined he would get married someday, but not now. He was only 34 years old, and there was still so much uncharted territory ahead of him. At the moment, however, he needed to appease Susan. After all, he had played no small part in what had happened, and was just as much to blame. Sighing and gradually calming down, he spoke. "Let's not worry too much. Life will put everything in its proper place. Let's go to my place." At the apartment, they experienced again what they so desperately desired. For a while, they forgot about the pregnancy. The problem seemed to disappear by itself, but what followed was like a horrible movie. Susan's mother, Pamela, when she learned of her daughter's predicament, made a huge scandal. Amazingly, she managed to get John's mother involved without his knowledge. John's mother had always wanted her son to start a family and give her grandchildren. For months, both mothers pressed John relentlessly, demanding that he marry Susan. Eventually, he gave in to their demands. John couldn't help but sympathize with Susan. After all, no one forbade him from cheating once he was married. However, this was a delusion. The wedding took place, then their first son was born, followed a year later by their second son. To John's horror, 2 years later, his wife unexpectedly became pregnant a 3rd time, despite his best efforts to prevent it. The two seemed incredibly compatible. By this point, the young family had taken out a loan to buy an apartment. John's parents, contributed financially, and split the payments between them, thus helping the young family. John, who worked as a simple laborer and received a modest salary, could only dream of having his own place. John's life became a nightmare. Susan's once attractive and alluring body had turned into something not very beautiful. Her breasts sagged, and her belly was adorned with layers of fat. Cellulite covered not only her thighs, but her arms as well. She showed no desire to change her appearance. Giving up a prestigious university education, she completely immersed herself in the world of diapers and baby snot, proudly proclaiming herself a housewife. The age difference between them became irrelevant, as the wife seemed even older than her husband. John had no way out. To somehow relieve the stress caused by the constant cries of children, he had short affairs. One day, Susan came to the conclusion that in the city, their children are deprived of fresh air and necessary vitamins, and persuaded him to buy a modest country home. At first, he was hesitant, but in time, he realized that this decision would allow him to spend more free time with his girlfriends. The inexpensive lakeside cottage pleased his wife, and he realized the advantages it offered. That afternoon, Susan gathered all the children and took them out of town. John, on the other hand, had some unfinished business and planned to join the family later. He intended to have some privacy with his new girlfriend, since her husband was away at work, and she claimed she was bored and needed a vacation. However, barely had John finished showering and applying a fragrant perfume to his skin when the doorbell rang. Frowning, he quickly wrapped a towel around himself and hurried into the hallway. On the threshold stood his mother-in-law, holding a large package. Glancing at her son-in-law, the woman lowered her eyes in embarrassment and muttered, "Susan and I agreed that I would help you clean up the house while the children are away." "I hope I'm not intruding," said the mother-in-law. John found himself in an awkward situation. A sudden warmth swept over him, especially under the towel, and reminded him of the feelings he had once had for Susan. They hadn't yet been married then. Despite his best efforts with other women, he couldn't replicate the same pleasure. The awkward pause lasted what seemed like an eternity until Susan's mother saw something she wasn't supposed to see. She blushed, handed her bag to John, and tried to squeeze past him into the apartment. When he reached out to take the bag, his fingers made contact with his mother-in-law's fingers, which were as soft and cool to the touch as Susan's. As she closed the door behind her, she looked at her son-in-law with a mixture of tension and shyness. Despite her age, she had maintained a flawless figure through careful grooming. John thought he lost his mind for a moment. Standing before him was Susan with her familiar piercing blue eyes and full lips. In an instant, the towels and clothes of the guests fell to the floor. The phone on the nightstand made a low, high-pitched sound. It was a call from a friend John had forgotten about, a friend who was expecting a date. At that moment, however, John didn't hear the call. His mind was consumed with concrete thoughts and concerns. Hours later, Susan's mother finally released herself from John's embrace, and a satisfied smile appeared on her face. She spoke, and there was sadness and understanding in her words. "I know you don't love my daughter. Since you've had your children, she's completely changed. I've tried to talk to her many times to make her realize that her husband can't be forgotten. But I don't think she can hear me. You are an amazing person, and I never wanted your family to fall apart. So I'm proposing a kind of arrangement. Sometimes you and I will do secret stuff, and you will continue to be with Susan, at least while the kids are little. No one will ever know what goes on between us. We have a family bond." John was willing to do anything for this woman. Silently taking her hand, he kissed it gently and pulled her to him. He had never imagined that he would be able to feel such happiness and joy again. Meanwhile, the mother-in-law was diligently tidying up, dusting and scrubbing the floors. John went to the village, where his wife was waiting for him, displeased as usual. But this time, her displeasure did not bother or anger him. As he closed his eyes, he mentally pictured his mother-in-law again and again. Story number 2. It was quite late when I packed up my fishing gear and headed home. The sun was beginning to dip behind the treetops, casting a warm glow on the neighborhood. In the distance, I heard footsteps approaching. I assumed it was a couple seeking privacy in a secluded spot and was dumbfounded when I saw it was my father-in-law and mother-in-law, whom my wife and I lived with. My father-in-law, 55, was a simple man who enjoyed hot drinks, while my mother-in-law, who was 8 years younger than him, rarely indulged in a drink, but became quite animated when she drank wine. She was a petite woman. The only thing they had in common that evening was their obvious state of intoxication. It was hard to tell if they were walking or supporting each other as they stumbled along. The only thing I could tell was that the father-in-law had one arm around his spouse's waist. Upon meeting me, my mother-in-law, Sarah, immediately took an interest in what kind of fish I had caught. She asked me to hold the rod while my father-in-law stood next to me and whispered something in her ear. Although I couldn't hear their conversation, his response was unexpectedly aggressive. "I don't care," he exclaimed, forcefully pushing my mother-in-law off the shore into the water and away. Fortunately, the water was warm enough. Not knowing what to do next, I crouched down next to her to catch my breath. She said she was cold, and I remembered I had a blanket. Without thinking, I pulled it out, and we sought warmth and comfort in its embrace. Pressed against each other, we gradually warmed up and dried off. I must admit that my mother-in-law, Sarah, despite her age, had a captivating appeal that attracted the attention of men. Her diminutive size was complemented by her stunning figure, and I often couldn't take my eyes off her. As we chatted in each other's arms, the sun began to set, painting the surroundings in dark colors. Quite by accident, my hand slid farther away than it should have. My mother-in-law's reaction came in the form of a kiss, which allowed me to relax and continue stroking her. Yes, I had never been fishing like this before, and even with a mature princess in the form of my mother-in-law, the blanket came in handy on both occasions. As soon as I packed up my fishing rods, we happily headed home. Such a fulfilling fishing trip was unexpected. However, the story with my mother-in-law did not end there. Another time, when we were left home alone, we decided to go to the sauna. I have to say that it was the most enjoyable time I've ever spent in a sauna. So now we have two favorite places, the sauna and, of course, fishing, which is where it all started. Story number 3. My father-in-law fell ill, hurting his back at work. In this connection, my mother-in-law asked me to help her prepare firewood for the winter. I like physical labor, so I readily agreed to help. My wife did not complain, as it gave her the opportunity to be at home in peace and quiet without me. I packed my things in a travel bag and set off for the village. Upon arrival, my mother-in-law welcomed me as an honored guest. The dining table was laden with delicious food, including a mouth-watering steak she had prepared. After a hearty lunch, I excused myself to go chop wood. Meanwhile, my father-in-law stayed home, confined to the couch due to back pain. Despite my mother-in-law's attempts to alleviate his condition with ointment massages, but he was not getting better. Over the years, the age difference between my father-in-law and mother-in-law became more and more apparent. While my father-in-law was in his 70s, my mother-in-law was 2 decades younger than him. Although she had aged greatly, her beauty was still evident. As I worked on chopping wood, I couldn't help but notice her attractiveness. She moved quickly around the house and yard, tirelessly going about her various tasks. Her energy and agility amazed me, especially in the scorching heat. I watched her from afar, marveling at her grace and vitality. Then I began to ponder, and new thoughts popped into my head. I wondered if she was as frisky in bed. Unfortunately, I didn't have an answer to that question. It was obvious that it had been a long time since she had done any physical activity at night in bed. How could anyone be intimate with such an elderly man? He could only moan in pain and take medication. No, I will refrain from speaking ill of my father-in-law. He is a decent man, abstains from alcohol, but his health has deteriorated a lot lately. In a few more years, he may need a cane. I couldn't help but feel sorry for my mother-in-law. No one spoils her. No one pushes her against the wall in a private corner. No one caresses her tender knee. What kind of life is this? My thoughts began to take an unusual turn. I began to fantasize, imagining a scenario in which she approaches me with a pitcher of water. In this fantasy, the jug accidentally falls to the side, and we both fall to the grass where something interesting happens between us. Well, you know what I mean. However, my fantasies were abruptly interrupted when my mother-in-law appeared next to me and offered me a jug of ice water. I didn't even notice her approach. "Drink up, son-in-law. It's scorching hot outside," she said. I took the pitcher and drank the water greedily, keeping my eyes on my mother-in-law. She looked concerned, perhaps because I had strong arms like a wrestler, and she enjoyed looking at my young and beautiful body. I realized that mere male affection wasn't enough for her, and even if it was, she would still devour me with her eyes. 1 minute of this was enough to realize that she longed to relive her youth once more. With a husband as young as I can remember, a spark of desire ignited in me. I was stabbing wood vigorously, releasing the stored energy that was growing sharper by the moment. Sensing something, my mother-in-law retreated into the house, increasing the tension between us. When the work was done, it was time for dinner. I called my mother-in-law over to prepare the meal. She quickly set the table, and we had a hearty dinner. Feeling tired, I decided to go to bed. When I entered the house, I found my father-in-law sleeping soundly and snoring loudly. His loud snoring interfered with my rest, so I decided to find another place to rest. My mother-in-law suggested a hammock outside in the shade where I could rest without too much noise. I had completely forgotten about the hammock I had set up in the spring. After changing into my swim trunks, I lay down on the hammock, swaying slightly. Suddenly, I heard a branch crack, and to my surprise, from behind a tree, my mother-in-law was watching me. Overwhelmed with a desire for warmth and affection, she joined me in the hammock, and we did exactly what we had dreamed of. My mother-in-law remembered her youth, and I now knew what she could do at night in the bedroom.